Okay, let's get started. Well, first off, thank you all for joining today. It's exciting to see so many people signed up for today. I think we had nearly over 250 people, and great to see people from all different parts of the world and representing all different industries, from healthcare and pharma to financial services, consumer packaged goods, education. So seeing a very diverse mix of folks, and I'm pleased to see the dramatic interest in applying behavioral science in making and improving our communications. The topic of our webinar, the science of persuasion using behavioral science and language strategy to drive action. Before we dive in, I want to just highlight a couple housekeeping items. The first is that our sessions today is set up for 60 minutes. We'll spend most of the time walking through the content, but we're hoping to have a little bit of time towards the end for questions. So if you, at any point you have questions, feel free to input those in the Q&A box, and we'll look to address those at the end of the session. If we're unable to get to them, I will personally reply back to those that have questions and answer them directly. And the last key point, being recorded. We are going to send that recording out after the conclusion of the webinar so you can circle back to it. And without further ado, let's begin. Let me first start by way of introduction. My name is Jason Martuscello. I'm an SVP here at maslansky+partners. And I do want to just share a little story which kind of paves the way for how I got interested in the behavioral sciences, and speaks a bit to my credibility speaking to you today. But my interest comes from a personal story, largely from losing over 120 pounds. And for those that are usually skeptical, I did include a photo. I lost all this weight when I was in my late teenage years, and I got super interested and curious about how and why I lost that weight. And I followed that curiosity down to University of South Florida, where I studied exercise physiology because I thought I lost the weight because of exercise and nutrition. And I spent several years in that domain and got certifications. I published research. I actually worked in the health and fitness space. And ultimately had a revelation that none of my weight loss was due to anything I learned in school. In fact, I lost all the weight before I had any type of education, any financial, I had no financial resources and had no professional help. And what I realized is I chalked that weight loss up to this field of behavioral science, those subconscious influences that play a role in how I was making those choices to eat better on a daily basis, to exercise and keep showing up and stay motivated. So this was really empowering for me, recognizing the power of behavioral science. And I pivoted and have largely worked in the behavioral sciences for the past 12, 13 years, but more importantly, applying it to how we can improve business outcomes via communication. So that's the nature of the topic today, is how we can leverage behavioral science to improve our communications. And over the years, I've worked with a lot of academics across the behavioral social sciences. So I've been really mentored and taught by leaders in the field. But most importantly, I'm most interested in how we can make it practical. So today's effort is really to kind of connect the dots between some of the science, but also how we can make that practical for communications. And a little bit about Maslansky+partners. We've been in the game for over 20 years. We are the world's leading language firm and founded on a simple idea. It's not what you say, it's what you hear. And ultimately, that is what our CEO, Michael Maslansky, sneered this elegant phrase. But he also said this quote, something along the lines that, there's two types of messages, the ones that are liked and the ones that actually have an impact. And more or less that tees up what behavioral science is for. Behavioral science is the delta between what people hear and like and actually what causes change. And behavioral science fundamentally is about behavior change and impacting people. So that is really at the crux of today. We're going to highlight three different topics, go through three different topics. The first is why messages fail. And even when, facts are right and the information we say is, correct, then we'll look at how people make decisions. This is kind of behavioral science 101, getting a sense of, some structure underneath how we think about and apply behavioral science. And then lastly is about connecting some of the dots in terms of crafting language that moves audience. So today is a topic that really covers off some of that science of behavior and the art of communication. So let's dive right in. Why messages fail, even when they are right. And when we think about this and take a step back, why messages fail, there's a lot of reasons why messages fail. We're not going to highlight all of them, but one of the core reasons is that we're not fully aware and we ignore the way in which people process information and make decisions from that. So I'm just going to showcase 3 elegant studies from the behavioral sciences to kick things off, and showcase how some of these behavioral biases play a role in how we're processing information and make decisions from those, and sometimes don't make decisions from those. So we'll first start with a quick poll. You don't have to actually select or do anything. I want you to just take a look at these 2 options and see which of them sounds better. Which option of ground beef sounds better? 25% fat ground beef or 75% lean ground beef? Now, we don't need a lot of time. Probably your answers are probably moving towards the right side of the screen in that lean ground beef option. And there was a famous Journal of Consumer Research study that really honed the point that is certainly going to be the more favorable option. And even though these are essentially the same options, right? They are just the reciprocal of one another, factually the same, but a complete different perception of when looked at in the study in terms of how that ground beef was perceived as healthy, tasty, and increased the probability of choice. So all this to say is that this is merely the same facts, but results in different perceptions and different actions as a result of that. Just merely a simple word, language change. The second study we're going to showcase is one of the more powerful demonstrations of language on cognition. And this comes from a study by Loftus and Palmer from eyewitness testimony research. And this study is brilliant. What they showed was a car accident in a video. And they showed this to all the different respondents. There was various groups, and within the groups, all the video was the same, but the question that was asked amongst the groups was slightly different. So the question was, how fast were the cars going when they, and for each of the group, they had a different verb in the question. So how fast were the cars going when they hit, when they smashed, when they contacted, when they collided, when they bumped each other. And you can start to think, how fast were they going? What were the speed estimates? Well, let's look at the data from this study. It's rather interesting. As you can imagine, the verb correlated with the speed impact estimated. This is across the groups. Contacted, you'll see hit, bumped, collided, smashed, being the more powerful verbs, and also ramped up the speed estimate that they perceived. That's not all about this study, though. The interesting thing came 2 weeks later when they followed up with these individuals and asked, what did you see glass at that scene of the accident in that video they saw? And what was interesting is, first off, there was no glass at the scene. So anyone that recalled glass, it was not actually there. And those that recalled glass were those that had the higher intensity verb, such as collided and smashed. So what does this tell us? This is profound, largely because the way in which the language was chose to ask the question, it really altered what people believed to be true in that video they saw weeks earlier. And there's a lot of this had ripple implications for the legal industry. But as we think about this as communicators, this is pretty powerful how words can dramatically impact how people perceive as well as remember information. This last study arguably is one of my favorite, largely because it circulates on actual behavior. This is a very well done, executed field study from Carol Dweck and her research group. And I think this is also fitting largely because we're coming right off midterms and voting. So what they did was simply send out questionnaires to residents for an upcoming election. And in the first batch, they asked how important is it for you to vote. In the second group and batch of mailers sent out, they asked how important is it for you to be a voter. And the result of this was super interesting. We had lower voter turnout for the top one. And for the bottom one, we had a 10% increase in turnout. This was actual behavioral turnout. They followed up with all these folks and found that there was an increased turnout amongst that second framing. So this showcased the power of identity and how it's a powerful driver of behavior. And just a simple word switch really dramatically can change the results of an outcome of an election, which is pretty powerful. So when we take a step back and look at all of these instances of these studies, what we're really trying to say here is that the way in which people process information is not fully rational. There's a lot of things that go on underneath the hood in terms of when people process emotions and speed and context, and there's a lot of heuristics and biases at play. And when we use language, there can be a powerful effect of taking the same facts and creating different perceptions, taking the same event and creating completely different memories, recollections of those memories, and then lastly, creating different behaviors because of it. But the power comes down to understanding what are the behavioral science drivers and barriers that ultimately play a role in how they impact individuals. And that is where we're going next. So behavioral science. Behavioral science is the science of decision making. It's understanding why people do what they do. And for all intents and purposes, we want to know that so we can create better communications. But let's first take a step back and get to why it's so important. Because I think there's some contextual elements to understand why behavioral science has gained in popularity and why it's become indispensable for creating effective communication. And it really boils down to a couple key Nobel Prize winning scientists, some of which you probably heard of. The first is Herbert Simon, who doesn't get a lot of credit, but back in the 1950s, he recognized early on that people do not have the cognitive bandwidth to process all the information that we have on a daily basis. There's these cognitive limitations, there's imperfect information, and there's even a lot of time constraints. We're always busy. And what this is collectively called is bounded rationality. And at the time, this was pretty revolutionary because economists were leading the way in terms of how people make decisions. And they think people process information, compare all alternatives, and make the most maximizing decisions. But what he found is people make good enough decisions. They satisfice. And that actually paved the way for a lot of research, a lot of new behavioral and social science research that spawned from this. Herbert Simon did win the Nobel Prize, and here's an interesting quote from him: "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else." And certainly Danny Kahneman, who certainly took note to a lot of Herbert Simon's work, which we'll see just in a moment. And many of you have heard of Daniel Kahneman through his popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And there's a lot underneath behavioral science. But if we had to summarize the entire field in one slide, this would probably be it. He revolutionized the way in which people process information and make decisions through his System 1 and System 2 metaphor, which is popularized in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think he's probably one of the best storytellers of all time, because if we know anything about the brain, it's infinitively complex, but he simplified it in two systems. And for all intents and purposes, it's very helpful for us as communicators, because what we need to know is that a lot of the ways in which people used to think people make decisions is on that System 2 side, that very rational, the economic processor. They calculate information, it's slow, deliberate, effortful. And what Danny found through his decades of amazing research is that people spend a lot of their day making decisions in this System 1 mindset. In fact, I worked with a a gentleman named Dr. David Neal, who spent a lot of his time focusing on how we form habits. And his research showed that we spend about 40 to 60% of our day in making habitual decisions. So, most of our day is dominated by system one. So we should actually spend a lot of our time thinking about how we play to that system one with our communications, understanding how information is processed in that fashion, and how we should be communicating to impact those types of behaviors. So his work was very fundamental in spawning a whole series of research across the behavioral and social sciences to uncover various heuristics and biases and behavioral science principles that play a role that showcase how people make decisions, in many cases not in a very rational way. And what we're going to do next is showcase 4 of them. There are many hundreds of behavioral science principles, heuristics, and biases, and we're not going to go through all of them. However, what we're going to do is go through some of them that reoccur in many of the categories, industries that I see, whether it's across healthcare, pharma, financial services, education. These are very ubiquitous across the consumer population. We see these day in and day out and are pretty ubiquitous. They are pretty universal, and there's also many others. So I don't want to say we're limiting. When we do our work at M&P, we certainly account for the full breadth of principles of drivers and barriers that play a role. But I want to highlight these largely because they're very ubiquitous in the research we do, as well as in the language that we create from. So let's start by hopping in each of these. The first is the status quo bias, and it's why people resist change. Many of you have go on browsers, go on websites, and you see, this pop up quite frequently about cookies. I'm not sure how many are aware of what this actually means, or people just automatically find themselves clicking it to move forward. This is an example of status quo. We just keep repeating, defaulting that behavior based on what we used to do. I actually looked at it recently, and there's actually a lot of things we remit to the websites we allow to trace our user behavior on these websites. But anyways, status quo is powerful. What we've historically done typically is something that we're going to keep doing. It's comfortable, it's familiar. The idea of change often is uncertain. The status quo bias typically finds itself a barrier for many brands and categories. Whether we're trying to have a HCP prescribe a new medication, whether we're trying to, launch a new product and get a new consumer product and want consumers to buy it, there is going to be a status quo bias that needs to be overcome, because our genuine tendency is to strive for consistency and not seek and embrace new behaviors. That is typically effortful, and we strive to keep a psychological equilibrium. We're not looking to always change things. So our preference is for keeping things the same. And any change is going to actually disturb that equilibrium. So it has to, we have to find a way to overcome that. So if we take a step back and look at, how that actually plays out, we have a little visual here that, illustrates this. So when we perform a behavior, we typically, may consciously decide to do that, but over time that becomes more automatic as we keep doing it, and it builds inertia. It becomes comfortable and familiar, and that more over time will be more a system one behavior. As something starts as system two, it moves into system one. It becomes habitual, and you can start to see how that can compound and become problematic over time as we look to change communications about influencing and creating impact and change. And this can be a status quo is typically can be a problem. And this often presents itself in different ways. And many various drivers and barriers and heuristics and these principles that we'll talk about today have, similar cousins, or different principles that are correlated with them. And a few of them relate to status quo bias, such as information of, George Lowenstein is one of my favorite scientists. He's done quite a bit of work on the economics of attention that showcase people actually try to actively avoid information that they think could be unpleasurable. Think about this in the healthcare space, people not wanting to get a medical test to check because they might anticipate a bad report, or people avoiding looking at their 401ks or their bank accounts. They call this the ostrich effect. These certainly may seem irrational, but people do these for certain reasons that can pose problems for us that are looking to move forward our customers, our patients, in our programs and services and offerings. So therapeutic inertia, this presents itself very, very often in the pharmaceutical space. Often HCPs are reluctant to intensify or initiate treatment because they want to stay with their old tried and true treatments. This can be very much a problem, as clinical data may show that a new treatment is better, but people's old behavior is where is going to be the dominating factor for persisting that old treatment. So a lot of times that's standing in the way. And the last example is habit. There's countless times we walk up to a consumer retail shelf and, we just buy the same old products, even though there's something new and better right next to it, or even potentially cheaper. A lot of times we buy based on habit, so status quo is connected to many of these different dimensions. And often these present themselves as barriers and things we need to overcome with our communications. How do we do that? And there's many different ways. Here's just a couple examples. One coming from Progressive, switch and save, overcoming inertia to showcase how you can easily save. This is more of a fluent way to overcome. Another way is kind of to showcase the problems, challenges with continuing down that tried and true path that people relentlessly follow down. And DocuSign had this campaign, The Time I Screwed Up, where it showed all these different instances of people screwing up from paper contracts. So getting people to reconsider and move out of that system one mindset to try something new. So these are just a couple examples. In terms of the summary here, behavioral truth, people stick with what they know. The communication shift is really about making that new behavioral feel like the next step, or making that current behavioral less desirable, right? And then in language, we could use words that signal that ease and control and continuity. Or in other cases, sometimes it's about stimulating novelty to, trigger that brain to move off of where they were before, right? Okay, great. We're going to move to our second principle now, cognitive fluency. If it's easy to process, it's easy to believe. This is one of my favorite principles. A lot of this work comes from Dr. Norbert Schwartz, amazing scientist out of USC. The easier something is to process, the more true, likable, and persuasive it feels. Ease equals credibility. Dr. Schwartz has published a number of studies, and a lot of his doctoral colleagues and students have gone on to produce even greater studies in this domain. I'm going to showcase many of them, but the result of fluency is really about if it's easier to process, it's going to be perceived as true, you're more apt to like it, more confident, more familiar, more memorable. Even this is independent of the content of the message itself. It's all about the cognitive processing of that information. It has nothing to do with the information itself, but it's how easy it is to process. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. So here's one of the studies they've conducted. And what they did was had different groups, and on the left, they saw the group on the left saw information on the left, and a second group saw the information on the right. And what you'll see about each of these is that the one on the left had information that was not rhyming, and the group on the right had information that had a little bit of a rhyme to the information. So you'll see what sobriety conceals, alcohol reveals. Life is mostly a struggle, life is mostly strife. And then caution and measure will win you riches, caution and measure will you treasure. So the only delta between the left and the right was really that rhyming element of the language chosen. And what the outcome of this was that information on the right was perceived as far more believable and true. 70% increase. And really, there's not a delta in terms of the actual factual correctness of that information. But, statements that rhyme and repetition, they increase that processing fluency. And there's ultimately that increase in conviction about their truthfulness, which is pretty powerful. This next one I love because it really connects back to behavior. In this particular study, which was titled, "If it's hard to read, it's hard to do." You might take away the conclusion already, but they gave two groups. One group on the left got the instructions on the left, and the group on the right got the instructions on the right. And all that was different between this was the font type. The instructions were identical. And what happened was that they asked, like, how hard was this? How long would it take? And essentially, what the takeaway was is people that got the instructions on the left perceived that exercise regimen as much harder and significantly harder to do. The group on the right, they perceived it as much easier to do. They estimated it would take 7 minutes quicker to do, and they had a higher likelihood to adopt this exercise regimen. That is pretty powerful for just changing the typeface of the instructions. And that's all about making it easier to process. Harder instructions make it harder to perform the behavior. So this comes down to not only the typeface, also the language that is used, but also how we present choices. Fluency happens on many levels. And this is a kind of a very popular study in the behavioral sciences. And what they did was, this was a retail study, and you can imagine, being in a retail setting, a lot of things are sampled all the time. In one condition, they had 24 jams on display. In another, they had 6. The 24 certainly had a higher ability for people to stop and try the jams. But interestingly, when it came down to purchase, it was paralyzing. A lot more people purchased jams in the 6-jar option display versus the 24. That's powerful. It's far more fluent and easier to make that decision. It's mind-numbing to think about how to choose a jam amongst 24 jams. And you could start to think about how this plays a role, like in menus and designing communications and presenting options for HCPs or for investors. How are we presenting options and choices for products we have, right? This spans the gamut, not just in text and language, but also in choices of the language and products. A couple of examples from the communications in the communications realm. One comes from Bank West of Australia, and they really just got a handle on their customers. And no, customers do not have time, to really, think about and process a lot when it comes to making their banking decisions. And digital banking shouldn't get in the way. So their campaign really leveraged in just enough bank, right? And they had several amazing video campaigns that really leverage this. And this is powerful because it's easy and fluent for a customer that's really not trying to have their banking over-engineered with tons of features and tons of activities, things that just make it feel complex and hard. On the other side is Geico. Everyone's likely heard of 15 minutes could save you more on your car insurance. And this is really powerful because it taps into that repetition and rhyme. And, it just really has beat itself into being true, even if it isn't true. I don't know if it's true, but, we hear it so much and it rhymes so well. It's on the tip of our tongue and it's just felt so real. There's another study I don't have in here, and they did on cognitive fluency with ticker symbols in the domain of investment management, and ticker symbols that were perceived as more familiar and easily readable were less risky to invest in. And these were just fictitious ticker symbols and names, but they were perceived as less risky. So all this to say is, cognitive fluency is really about the cognitive processing when it comes to our communications, when we frame things and develop language to present to customers and our audiences. So cognitive fluency is really about making or people believing what feels easy to process. It's about making it easier to absorb, removing and stripping jargon and friction, and leveraging various different tactics, such as using concrete words as opposed to abstract things that require more cognitive processing. And then using familiar phrasing and repetition, using rhyme and parallel structure are just some examples of how this can come into fruition. We're going to pivot now to our next one, social norms. When in doubt, we do what others do. Many of you may have heard of social norms. One of my vivid examples I get every day is coming to work and passing Apollo bagels in the West Village. Those of you in New York may have heard or familiar with Apollo bagels and maybe more familiar with their massive lines that tail out of the store, even in subthermal temperatures. And the reason there's that, I really actually don't know if these are phenomenal bagels. I've not had them. But there's a reason I bring this up is because that line signals to people who don't know whether is this a good bagel place. They know that this is a good bagel place, largely because of that line. The West Village is not short of bagel shops. There's dozens within a few mile radius. But when people are in absence of knowing where to eat and what to choose, they rely on shortcuts such as what others do. And social proof is a powerful example. When people line up, this steers our behavior to do certain things. And there's no greater scientist who hammered this point in his book than Robert Cialdini, who is professor emeritus at ASU, but probably more widely known by his book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. And one of his 6 persuasive principles is social norms. And a famous quote of his is, intuition tells us behavior is more correct to the degree that we see other people doing it. So when it comes to new products, information that comes to us, we often rely on the behavior of others to dictate how we behave, how we make decisions, to determine what is something we should do. To make this practical for you, there's kind of 3 ways we can think about social normative behavior. There's kind of 3 kind of core groups that steer our decisions and behavior. The first is the close. Those are people that are family and friends, people we trust within our networks, in our communities. We have this example of Peloton here. And we also take tips from our peers and get information recommendation. The second is going to be the powerful. So we have an example here of Oprah's favorite things. That list, people buy that. Don't even question it. Obama's book list, people start, automatically getting those books. Key opinion leaders, people that have status, political figures, these people influence people, right? These are trusted authorities. When they say something, we listen. When they do something, we follow them. So the other third one is also very interesting. It's the many. It's not necessarily a specific person. The example I commonly give is, how Amazon, the review portion of Amazon. Many people now go to Amazon and don't even look at product descriptions. They automatically go to the reviews. Why? Because that signals that if something has a lot of reviews and they're, relatively high number of stars, we don't question it. We go with it. It signals that it's safe. We can buy it, right? So the same thing is we look to these different reference groups to help shortcut our decision making. And you can start to think about this as communicators, how this can be powerful, because we can describe the behavior of others to influence those we're trying to influence. Let me showcase this with a couple examples. We have signaling the number one choice. On the left, Listerine has largely focused on how they are the number one dentist and hygienist recommended mouthwash brand. They've done this for decades. And when people walk up to the shelf and, they see a sea of options of mouthwash, this sways decision making because it's number one. Many people recommend it, that they are trusted authorities, and that they put their faith in for their oral care decisions. That's powerful. On the right, this is, very personal to me because I have 2 little young ones, one that's turning 1 next month. And, when we first had to make a decision around baby formula, we didn't know what to think of. But seeing #1 brand fed in hospitals, that is certainly going to influence decisions. When I see that in a hospital, when it says it's #1, that's certainly something that gravitates towards swaying decision making. This isn't talking about how pure necessarily the formula is on top. This is talking about how people trust this brand and trust this formula. So that signals that I should be doing this. And that's powerful. Another couple examples along the social proof domain comes from Calm, which is a meditation app. If you go to their website, you'll see a couple social proof statements hammered right in front of you. Calm your mind, change your life. The #1 sleep app, the #1 app for sleep, meditation, and relaxation. They are not shying away from being #1, nor are they shying away from using social proof a few clicks down on over 2 million 5-star reviews. That just signals the power and pervasiveness of usage of this app and the satisfaction with it, not to mention the testimonials right beneath it. Another example comes from Rocket Mortgage, and they have this brilliant illustration of joining 10 million members. They just showcase how many members are just already signed up. It makes you want to sign up, and then showing visuals and happy faces right next to them. It just pulls you along for the journey. Social proof and social norms are powerful. So to summarize, we often look to decide what's right by looking at others. Seeing others do something, it makes the choice safe. It makes the behavior compelling. And when we think about the communication shift, we want to make the desired behavioral visible. So describing the actual behavior, instead of telling people, we want to show them. Join 10 million members, over 2 million 5-star reviews, things that signal that this is the recommended choice or the dominant behavior or the trending behavior. There's many ways to slice and dice social norms and social proof, but the idea is we want to showcase behavioral momentum towards that option. And this can get showcased in every industry, every sector. It's incredibly powerful, very universal, experienced across the world. So this is something we often find baked into our language strategies to help influence behavior. Our last one we have here is loss aversion. And this is really about people acting faster to avoid losses than pursuing gains. This is probably one of the most famous findings in behavioral science from Danny Kahneman, but also one that is most for communicators as well. And this is a quote from Danny Kahneman himself: "People don't weigh gains and losses equally. They're wired to avoid pain more than motivated to seek pleasure." This is the easiest way I describe this principle is like, let's just imagine if I were to give you $100. Certainly this would feel very good, right? People would feel good to take that $100. Oh, I have $100 extra. Now let's wipe that scenario from your memory. And let's just say I were to go and take $100 from your wallet. You would probably be furious to find out that you didn't have that $100. That delta between, that emotional delta between the pleasure you felt of gaining $100 and that displeasure of losing the $100 is loss aversion. The pain of losing is twice as potent as the pleasure of gaining. Okay? And this, summed up to what is, more commonly known as losses loom larger than gains. And what does this mean for communicators? It means that we want to avoid pain more than the equivalent gain. So we want to focus on sometimes communicating what we're preventing, what we're avoiding losing, and what we're protecting, as opposed to what we're gaining or benefiting. And there's a lot of industries and sectors that are very ripe for this, whether it's the insurance space, the investment community, where it's all about protecting our downside or protecting our assets. A couple examples I have here. One relates to Grammarly. Grammarly is the software that connects corrects our grammar, our spelling, our language. And they have a campaign that's focused on avoiding mistakes before they happen. And really, it's really about avoiding that embarrassment, saving yourself. And a lot of the imagery associated with this is certainly about thinking about that and avoiding these things, right? So, and when you start thinking about avoiding these things, that makes Grammarly far more favorable and alluring and attractive to have, knowing that it could prevent a lot of these mistakes from happening and avoiding these negative scenarios and situations. There's some interesting videos with their campaigns that really bring that to life, which I thought was very impressive, that really capitalize on that loss aversion. Delta, really, for those that have, various statuses with American Advantage or medallion status, they do, certain messaging campaigns that say, don't lose your medallion status. People, fight tooth and nail to protect these things, right? They'll do what they need to do. I'll hop on another flight, etc. So, this is really just about framing in a way that prevents them from losing what they have. They don't want to be stripped of their status, so they're going to do certain behaviors or sign up or commit or buy, etc. So it's really about focusing on preventing the losses. I have a couple other examples here. Protection and prevention. This is also correlated to this other popular behavioral science principle called the regulatory focus theory. And here's an example on our left where Under Armour really presents this case on protect this house. They're framing about very much protecting, where Nike takes the opposite stance. And it's not to say one is right or wrong, nor am I saying loss aversion is universally going to be impactful across all communications or categories. But this is something we develop different communications, and then that's why we always test them. For Nike, they take a more promotion approach by just do it. I certainly saw Nike littered across the New York City Marathon, very much on that aspirational side of things, where Under Armour takes the prevention side, the protection side, which is interesting. And we certainly surface a lot of these things in language landscape analysis, where we, pretty much compare competitors on their language. And this is important to do, to look at the, how different approaches are taken within different categories. And you'll see here on your right, Crest and Colgate, they take a very similar stance in prevention, right? Protect. And this is a category that certainly people really want to avoid at all costs, their dentists. So loss aversion summary, you'll see here the behavioral truth. People act faster to avoid pain than pleasure. A lot of times we got to consider about ways in which we can frame around protection, prevention, avoiding the risks, and not just about highlighting the potential benefits from our products, our portfolios, and whatever our business and services offer. In many cases, we need to think about, preventing things. And so think about the 1- frame in that. In language, we just have some examples, as we mentioned. Don't lose your status, avoid these mistakes, or protect what matters. Think about insurance, health, finance, etc. So this is loss aversion. This is our fourth principle. We talked about each of these principles all play a role in human behavior. There's many, many more that come into play. When it comes to M&P's work, we always try to identify what are the most interesting and relevant behavioral science principles, these behavioral drivers and barriers that play a role in specific engagements. I just want to end with a quote from none other than Professor Dan Ariely, behavioral economist. Marketing is often about getting people to do the right things for the wrong reasons. I think this quote is immensely powerful, because when it comes to finding communication that's impactful, we try to think a lot, but at the end of the day, the way in which communication works isn't rational. So it may not make sense. And this is why we always test things, because we want to see what influences people. And sometimes on the surface, it may not make sense. Underneath how people process things and the heuristics and biases that are at play, it can work. And often it does work. So this is why we like to go beyond that surface level and understand the dynamics, what make people tick, what motivate them, what influence them, to make decisions and influence their behavior. We, as a company, use behavioral science to uncover those hidden reasons why people don't act, and then use language to remove those barriers. Okay, when it comes to, actually connecting the dots now, how do we move from that science of behavior, understanding what motivates people? We understand these drivers and barriers and put them into language, right? So our process is pretty robust. Just going to walk through a few slides that showcase how we do it. We really like to get a sense of the target behavior. For every challenge, every communication challenge, there always is a target behavior, right? We want to understand how we can move someone from a current state to a future state, whether that's to prescribe a product, whether it's to buy a product, whether it's to, adopt a service, sign up for a 401k, whatever it is. There is a current status quo behavior and then where we want them to go. And to get there, we need to map out the drivers and barriers. We need to understand those conscious and non-conscious drivers and barriers, those heuristics and biases that get us there. There's always things that prevent a behavior. These are the barriers, and they could be conscious and unconscious. Then there's always drivers, things that facilitate that. And we always build out hypotheses to ensure we're capturing all of these different heuristics and biases and drivers and barriers. And ultimately identify what are the most important ones for our particular client for that specific context and category. Once we do this, we create a map, right? So we map out fully what are those conscious barriers, and there's probably the common ones. Under an investment, the competitors got bigger budgets, we're not buying a lot of advertising, so we're limited in our channels. Or maybe our efficacy is not as good as our competitors, or our competitors got the market leader advantage, et cetera, or our competitors got a better technology, blah blah blah. But where a lot of the important stuff is in these non-conscious factors, right? The non-conscious barriers and the non-conscious drivers. And these are just examples in here. We do this for all of our clients to get a sense of what they are and which are most important. And then what we do is pull them into develop frames, right? So we have various different frames we develop, which formulate into narratives that we ultimately test. The drivers and the drivers are ultimately the kind of horsepower which drive the communication frames, right? They are what motivate people and also separate. They become distinctive, so we can test them and isolate what becomes more effective. So it's important that we pull this through into our language, because ultimately language that's based on these behavioral science principles becomes more effective. So when we look at it, this is what it looks like. We uncover these drivers and barriers, we develop frames, we test, we conduct research, and using various behavioral science approaches as well. And then we create a language strategy based on that's fundamentally rooted in those behavioral science principles. And ultimately, this is what makes our recipe so effective in terms of our language strategies. So let's just pull together in our remaining time some examples of some practical things we've done. So here's an example from Organon, and we've worked with a client launching an arm implant for birth control. And, this is a very revolutionary and innovative product, but it struggled with adoption. And the key barrier with this product launch, and it really had anything to do with efficacy, but it really was about fear of losing control. You can imagine that, a lot of women are more comfortable with the traditional IUD. And this new format really was concerning, right? It's not very familiar, and so we recognized this when we spoke to various patients as well as HCPs about some of these barriers. So what we identified was we identified the shift of reframing from the arm implant to the non-uterine implant, and this was pretty powerful. Largely because we're defining it by what it isn't, and we significantly reduce the risks that are associated with the arm implant. And it made that unfamiliar feel much safer. Was it perfect? No, but it helped reduce the risk. And ultimately, that small shift helped turn patients into, more of a curiosity instead of being super cautious, which, significantly opened that door for adoption. So this was pretty powerful. The next example here comes from Merck and Gardasil with the vaccine. They launched this vaccine, and the message was focused on, you need we need this vaccine to protect against sexually transmitted infections. As you can imagine, this being, for young children, that can be very off-putting and trigger discomfort, as it did. Especially as it applied, kids were sexually active, which, was also, there's going to be resistance with that type of message and framing. We've recognized these barriers easily and quickly, and we identified an interesting frame, tested it, and it proved to be pretty powerful. And this was really about the power to protect your child. That subtle reframing shifted things from a medical task to really a parental priority and an instinct. You kind of created that, you triggered that identity of a parent. And every parent wants to protect their child, right? And that reduced the resistance from that original message and changed the conversation around protection. And this is really just a powerful example of identifying that identity framing and how that can really change the game from pushing a message to actually pulling people in and garnering support for vaccinations. So this was immensely powerful in terms of that reframe. My last example comes from Invesco and really changing the industry by changing the language. In the early 2000s, investment industry was really facing a credibility crisis in terms of rejecting these promises around guaranteed anything, guaranteed incomes for life. There's a lot of skepticism. It sounded very too good to be true. And, maybe it certainly does now too, as well. So we applied behavioral science to get a sense of what needed to be overcome, and there was certainly trust deficits. But what we developed various hypotheses along different dimensions of various drivers, and loss aversion was one of those powerful ones. And we changed the game by switching the language to protected growth, and anchoring that message from guaranteeing a benefit and income for life to protecting what we have was very powerful. It was far more believable. And this new lexicon really took off kind of across and spread globally. And you can think about it in your own walk of life. And as for those on the call in the investment space, it's powerful. And, along Warren Buffett's line of communication, it's really about, protecting your assets, not losing them, right? That's rule number 1 and 3, I think, of his 3 rules. So this was really powerful, leveraging that loss aversion insight to really shift the conversation and dramatically improve the result for our client here. So we're finishing up now. As we think about it, let's take a step back. Everyone who's a communicator is in the business of behavior change. Whatever we're doing, we need to find the language that prescribes our medication, believes in a vision, buys the product, captures attention. We're trying to change behavior. To do that, we really need to overcome those critical gaps, right? What we say is not always what they hear, nor is it never what they do. But when we combine the power of behavioral science and language strategy, we can really transcend that gap from what people say to what they hear and impact what they do. That is going to be critically important about leveraging these disciplines. Behavioral science is the science of decision making. It helps us understand the why people what they do. And then more importantly, language strategy is the how we move them to act. We need to find that right language based on that, on our understanding of why what they do, ultimately to impact our audiences and have greater impact with our communications. I want to leave with a couple of things as we think about moving forward, ways in which we can help you. We have a full suite of offerings. Those that are not familiar with our language strategies, we do a whole We do a whole realm, a suite of offering in terms of messaging and communication, but those that are very closely aligned to behavioral science, we do a drivers and barriers analysis, which feeds into a lot of our language strategy. And it really connects the dots between what a fundamental understanding of our audience is before we develop those language strategies. And another thing I'd be remiss not to mention is our new product offering, Chorus, our synthetic audience product and tool set, which has been really taking off to really capture audience understandings across various industries, where we can do this very cost effectively and quickly. I know as Q4 is coming around, we have, tight timelines and budgets. And, these are two things I would like to leave with as you think about in your remaining Q4. We are at our end. I do want to thank everyone for taking the time. If there's any questions, I would love for you to send them to the Q&A. I would be glad to answer questions. Or you can feel free to ping me at the email address below, and I would be glad to answer questions, walk through any of these decks, or any of these topics or examples, or be happy to talk about some of the challenges you have. So thank you so much. I don't see any questions right now, but I'll sit here for a couple moments. But I really appreciate you all joining for today, and thanks for spending time with me. Thank you so much.